As they planned their most ambitious offensive yet, North Vietnam's leaders knew they were taking a big gamble. There would still be U.S. troops in South Vietnam which could easily be reinforced. The question was, would the Americans send major combat units to save their South Vietnamese allies? More than any offensive they had launched before, this one would depend on speed and mobility. For the North, it would be a new kind of battle, using tanks and artillery to smash through enemy lines. The plan foresaw 3 major armored thrusts slicing deep into South Vietnam. The first North Vietnamese attack would cross the demilitarized zone, separating north and south, and push east from Laos. 2 whole provinces and the cities of Quang Tri, Hue, and Da Nang would be captured. The second thrust would attack through the central highlands to the coast at Quy Non. The third assault would strike from Cambodia and capture An Lac. There, a provisional revolutionary government would be established for the South. If resistance was still light, units would press on and capture the capital, Saigon. North Vietnamese commanders knew that attacking the South in 3 different places was a risky plan. In none of the attacks would they have an overwhelming superiority of troops over the enemy. However, General Giap believed that multiple thrusts would keep the South guessing about what might come next. At the same time, the North's bargaining position in future negotiations would be improved dramatically. By January 1st, 1972, only 133,000 U.S. servicemen remained in South Vietnam. 2/3 of American troops had gone in 2 years. Australian and New Zealand contingents were also about to leave, and South Korean forces had already begun to return home. The ground war was now almost exclusively the province of the South Vietnamese Army. As Vietnamization had gone on, U.S. field commanders had been under orders from Washington to keep American casualties down. Most operations were now defensive, designed to protect U.S. bases from mortar and rocket attacks. Above the demilitarized zone, General Giap deployed 2 divisions, including the elite 308th and 3 independent infantry regiments. The infantry were backed by tank, artillery, and sapper regiments. Another division was poised in Laos, opposite the former U.S. base at Khe Sanh. In the early months of 1972, the North Vietnamese infiltrated a division supported by independent infantry regiments into South Vietnam. Another 2 divisions were already on the coastal plain. More divisions were deployed on the western border. Further south, another formation threatened the Mekong Delta. Till now, North Vietnam had been fighting an infantry war. The coming offensive would be very different. A modern conventional battle of firepower and maneuver would pose a whole range of completely new problems. The 125,000 men now massing on South Vietnam's borders would be going into battle alongside over 600 tanks, a bigger army than General Patton had commanded in World War II. The tanks would consume huge quantities of fuel and ammunition. The infantry would have to keep up with the armor, and that meant large numbers of trucks. The battle would move fast, putting strains on the communication and command systems unlike anything the Army had met before. South Vietnam was divided into 4 military regions, each the responsibility of an Army corps. Altogether, the South fielded 11 infantry divisions and an airborne division, 3 Marine brigades, 10 Ranger groups, and 4 brigades of tanks. The Air Force deployed 9 squadrons of combat aircraft, 14 of helicopters, and 3 air transport squadrons. U.S. Army combat forces were now down to a handful of units at Da Nang, around Saigon, and at Can Tho in the Delta. The Air Force also had 2 tactical fighter wings, a reconnaissance wing, and a B-52 wing in Thailand. The Navy carriers Hancock and Coral Sea were still on Yankee Station in the Gulf of Tonkin. By early 1972, many of the 133,000 U.S. ground troops in South Vietnam were occupied closing up bases and preparing to withdraw. But aviation units of the Army, Navy, and Air Force were still operating, as were logistics and communications specialists. So were 1,400 Army and Marine advisors attached to South Vietnamese units. On March 30th, 1972, barrage. The targets for the guns and rockets were South Vietnamese positions across the demilitarized zone, separating north and south. As the guns blasted South Vietnamese defenses, upwards of 20,000 of Giap's troops and 200 of his 600 tanks waited in their jumping-off positions. At noon, they surged forward as the South Vietnamese units fled in panic. Facing the northern onslaught was a weak South Vietnamese infantry division and a Marine brigade. Their 12,000 troops were scattered across 13 combat bases and outposts. The enemy assault caught the infantry division just as it was moving regiments from one position to another. The southern defense was thrown into complete chaos. Intelligence reports had predicted a northern attack, but no one had expected it to come on the demilitarized zone. After 2 days of confused fighting, On April 2nd, the South Vietnamese began to retreat to a new defensive line. The northern offensive across the demilitarized zone had forced the South Vietnamese to fall back to Route 9 and the Qua Viet River. To the west, the line was held by Camp Carroll, the Rock Pile, and the My Loc combat base. In 2 days, these bases fell and the NVA pushed to within 10 miles of Quang Tri City. Further south, the city of Hue was threatened from 2 directions. Facing the NVA were the South Vietnamese 1st Division and a division of Marines. The attack opened on April 1st, 1972. To the west, the 324B Division pushed Southern forces back in heavy fighting. For a time, the defenders held a line from the Mai Chan River to Firebase Bastogne, an old American outpost. But soon, even that line was being pushed back. The North Vietnamese attack on Quang Tri City and the push towards Hue were furious assaults. But on April 9th, after a few days of fighting, the NVA were forced to halt their attacks and resupply. Outside Quang Tri, the North's failure to keep up the pressure saved the South Vietnamese defense from complete collapse. For the first few days of the northern offensive, 3 days after the first North Vietnamese attack, in the far south of Vietnam, there was another major thrust. This time, the assault was barely 50 miles from the southern capital, Saigon. The South Vietnamese forces defending Saigon were the 18th Division, the 5th Division, and the 25th, along with 3 Ranger groups. On the North Vietnamese side, 3 divisions, at one time Southern Viet Cong, but now almost completely northern, were backed by tanks and 2 independent infantry regiments. The North Vietnamese first launched a diversionary attack towards Tay Ninh City, overrunning South Vietnamese garrisons. In the main blow, the 5th Division assaulted Loc Ninh. In spite of intense American air support, the town fell. Meanwhile, the 7th cut Route 13 and the 9th prepared to attack An Lac. The assault at An Lac had been entrusted to the 9th Division, but almost a week passed and the division still hadn't launched its attack. During the holdup, American helicopters were ferrying men and supplies into the threatened city. B-52 strikes hit the NVA assembly areas with devastating effect. VA finally mounted its assault on An Lac on April 13, 1972. At once, American helicopter gunships pounced on the attackers. Spearheaded by tanks, North Vietnamese troops managed to seize the northern part of the city. But they failed to break the defense. The 4,000-strong South Vietnamese force, reinforced by elite airborne units, held their positions and launched furious counterattacks, accompanied by renewed B-52 strikes. The carnage would continue until on May 15th, the Viet Cong forces withdrew. In the Central Highlands, the targets for two NVA divisions were the provincial capitals of Kon Tum and Pleiku. The defenders, the South Vietnamese 22nd Division, fell back in disarray, but were instantly reinforced, and they succeeded in holding the town. Meanwhile, the NVA seized control of most of Binh Dinh province, threatening to cut the country in two. On April 6th, Nixon ordered the resumption of full-scale airstrikes over the north and naval gunfire to support the beleaguered South Vietnamese. On April 27th, 2 weeks after the first North Vietnamese attack on Quang Tri City, the NVA renewed their assault. Reinforced by the 325th Division, they pushed to within a few miles of the city. The defenders, the South Vietnamese 3rd Division, which had withstood heavy bombardment for over a month, panicked and fled down Highway 1, along with thousands of civilians. Meanwhile, the North Vietnamese army took possession of Dong Ha on April 29th and Quang Tri on May 1st. Abandoned by their officers, the flight of the South Vietnamese Army's 3rd Division, along with the soldiers' families and the inhabitants of Quang Tri, was a rout. In the confusion, bridges were blown too soon, stranding men and equipment. The road had been mined, and the North Vietnamese added to the chaos by shelling the retreating columns with tank and artillery fire. As many as 20,000 may have been killed or wounded, many of them civilian refugees. The fear now was that the NVA would follow up their victory by storming down Route 1 to the city of Hue. There, the South Vietnamese Army's 1st Infantry Division and 2 brigades of Marines were dug in round the city. In fact, massive American firepower, including the heavy guns of warships offshore, made certain the northern divisions could advance no further. American air support for the South Vietnamese Army, codenamed Operation Freedom Train, had unleashed tens of thousands of airstrikes against the attacking northern troops and their supply lines. 2 days after the invasion, the Americans had also started to bomb North Vietnam, the first big raids in 3.5 years. American bombers, including B-52s, were attacking military facilities, supply depots, rail yards, and fuel storage. North Vietnamese leaders had expected the raids, but they were sure that pressure from their allies, the Soviet Union and China, would stop the Americans launching an all-out air offensive. The North had miscalculated badly. Both superpowers were far more interested in good relations with the Americans than with the fate of Vietnam. The American airstrikes on both South and North Vietnam were launched by Air Force planes from Thailand, Navy aircraft from carriers in the Gulf of Tonkin, and B-52s from Thailand and the Pacific. By June, 77 aircraft were brought down by NVA gunfire. The attack swept northward and within 2 weeks were hitting targets around Hanoi and Haiphong. In a second phase, codenamed Operation Linebacker, power stations and airfields were hit. The strategic port of Haiphong and 6 other harbors were mined and closed to all sea traffic. Soon after, the rail and road transport links to China were the targets for heavy raids.
United States forces have been directed to take appropriate measures.
With Operation Linebacker, the American President Richard Nixon meant to force North Vietnam's leaders to call off their offensive against the South and negotiate a peace. It was a ferocious campaign. On July 19th, the South Vietnamese Army, with U.S. air support, began a drive to recapture Binh Ninh province and its cities. The battles would last until September 15th, by which time Quang Tri was reduced to rubble. The NVA, however, still held the northern part of the province. In 5 months of battles, the attackers reckoned they had killed 100,000 NVA and NLF troops and had captured vast quantities of weaponry. The offensive was over.